Welcome back, dear listener, to another soft-spoken stroll through the shadows of the past. Whether the night is just beginning for you or you're listening as sleep slowly arrives, I'm happy you've chosen to spend this time here with me. Let me know in the comments. Are you listening from somewhere far and quiet, or in the heart of a busy city winding down? And if these calming explorations bring a sense of rest, please consider subscribing. There are countless more voices from the past still waiting to be heard, but here's what's absolutely mind-blowing. Despite all this brutality, these children grew up to become some of the most feared and respected warriors, explorers, and traders in human history. They discovered America 500 years before Columbus. They struck fear into the hearts of European kingdoms, and they built a civilization that lasted for centuries. So how did such miserable childhoods create such legendary adults? In this video, I'm going to take you inside the shocking world of Viking childhood, revealing the 7 most brutal realities that these kids faced every single day. I've spent months researching historical accounts, archaeological evidence, and expert testimonies to uncover the truth about what life was really like for the youngest members of Viking society. What you're about to discover will completely change how you think about childhood parenting and what it truly takes to survive in this world. And trust me, by the end of this video, you'll never complain about your own childhood again. But before we dive into this dark journey, let me give you some context about just how different the Viking world was from ours. We're talking about a society that existed roughly from 793 to 1066 AD, spanning across what we now know as Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. These weren't just random barbarians pillaging villages for fun. They were sophisticated people with complex social structures, advanced seafaring technology, and a culture that valued honor above everything else, including life itself. The problem is when honor and survival are your top priorities, childhood becomes something entirely different. These weren't helicopter parents worried about their kids getting scraped knees on the playground. These were parents preparing their children for a world where weakness meant death, where winter could kill your entire family, and where your ability to fight determined whether you lived to see another spring. Now, you might be thinking, surely, it wasn't that bad. Kids are resilient, right? Well, let me put this into perspective for you. The average life expectancy for a Viking was around 30 to 35 years old. That means by the time you were 10, you were already approaching middle age. In their world, there was no time for a prolonged childhood, no luxury of innocence, no gentle transition into adulthood. You were either ready for the harsh realities of Viking life, or you didn't make it. Archaeological evidence from Viking settlements paints a picture that's even grimmer than the historical accounts. We found children's graves with weapons, indicating that kids as young as 6 were expected to defend themselves. We've uncovered evidence of child labor so intense that it left permanent marks on their developing bones. We've discovered burial sites where entire families, including infants, were found with signs of starvation and disease. But here's where it gets really interesting. And this is something that most history books won't tell you. The Vikings actually had a word for children who couldn't handle this brutal lifestyle. They called them nid, which roughly translates to disgrace or shame. If you couldn't prove your worth as a child, you weren't just considered weak. You were considered a burden on the entire community. Think about that for a moment. In our world, we celebrate childhood, we protect it. We extend it for as long as possible. In Viking society, childhood was something to be endured and overcome as quickly as possible. The faster you could prove you were useful, the better your chances of survival became. And this brings us to the first brutal reality that Viking children faced. Something that would shock modern parents to their core. From the moment they could walk, these kids were thrust into a world where they had to earn their place in the family. In the community and in life itself, there was no unconditional love, no participation trophies, no gentle encouragement. There is only one question that mattered. What can you contribute for? Now, before you start thinking that Viking parents were heartless monsters, you have to understand the world they were living in. This wasn't cruelty for the sake of cruelty. This was survival. The harsh climate, the constant threat of raids, the unpredictable food supply, the diseases that could wipe out entire settlements. All of these factors created a society where only the strong survived, and strength had to be developed from the earliest possible age. But what exactly did this mean for a typical Viking child's daily life? How early were they expected to start contributing? What kinds of tasks were they given? And perhaps most importantly, what happened to the children who couldn't keep up? The answers to these questions reveal a childhood so different from our modern experience that it's almost impossible to imagine. We're talking about 5-year-olds who are responsible for tending livestock in freezing temperatures, 7-year-olds who are expected to help with dangerous farming tasks, and 9-year-olds who are already learning the skills they'd need to survive on their own, and that's just the beginning. The physical hardships were only one part of the equation. Viking children also faced psychological pressures that would break most modern adults. They were raised in a culture that glorified violence, that celebrated death in battle, that taught them their worth was measured by their ability to inflict pain on others. Imagine being told from the time you could understand language that the highest honor you could achieve was to die fighting. Imagine growing up in a world where showing fear, showing weakness, showing any sign of vulnerability could result in being cast out from your family and community. Imagine being a child and knowing that your survival depended not on being loved, but on being feared and respected. This psychological conditioning started incredibly early. Viking children weren't told bedtime stories about princesses and happy endings. They were told stories about warriors who died gloriously in battle, about gods who rewarded violence and punished cowardice, about ancestors who earned their place in Valhalla through acts of brutality that would horrify modern audiences. But here's what's truly fascinating about all of this. It worked. Despite the harshness, despite the brutality, despite the psychological trauma that would send modern children into therapy for decades, Viking children grew up to become some of the most successful people of their time. They explored farther, fought harder, and achieved more than almost any other civilization in human history. So what does this tell us about childhood? About human resilience? About what it really takes to prepare kids for the real world? Are we making our children too soft? Are we protecting them from challenges that would actually make them stronger? Or were the Vikings taking things too far, creating warriors at the expense of human compassion and emotional well-being? These are the questions that we'll be exploring as we dive deeper into the 7 brutal realities of Viking childhood. Each one of these realities will challenge everything you think you know about raising children, about what childhood should look like, and about what it means to prepare the next generation for success. The first reality we need to examine is something that happened before these children could even speak. Something that determined their fate from the moment they took their first breath. It's a practice so shocking, so alien to our modern sensibilities, that when historians first uncovered evidence of it, many refused to believe it was real. But the archaeological evidence is undeniable, and the historical accounts are consistent across multiple sources. What we're talking about is a practice that put Viking children at risk from day one, that separated the strong from the weak before they even had a chance to prove themselves. And that set the tone for everything that would follow in their short, brutal lives. And before you think you know what I'm talking about, let me tell you that this first reality is probably not what you're expecting. It's something that reveals the true nature of Viking society. something that shows just how different their values were from ours, and something that explains why Viking children had to grow up so fast, so hard, and so completely without the safety net that modern children take for granted. This first brutal reality was something called exposure, and it happened within the first few days of a child's life. When a Viking baby was born, they weren't automatically welcomed into the family like children are today. Instead, they were placed on the ground in front of their father, and he had to make a choice that would determine whether this child lived or died. If the father picked up the baby, it meant the child was accepted into the family. But if he walked away, if he decided this child was too weak, too sickly, or simply one mouth too many to feed during a harsh winter, that baby would be left outside to die from exposure to the elements. We're talking about newborns, barely hours old, being abandoned because they didn't meet their father's standards for survival. Now, you might think this was rare, that it only happened in extreme circumstances. But archaeological evidence suggests this practice was disturbingly common. We found the remains of infants in areas outside Viking settlements, buried without the ceremonies and grave goods that would indicate they were considered full members of the community. These weren't stillbirths or natural infant deaths. These were healthy babies who were deliberately abandoned because they were deemed unworthy of the resources it would take to raise them. But here's where it gets even more disturbing. The decision wasn't just based on the child's physical condition. Sometimes perfectly healthy babies were abandoned simply because they were girls and the family needed boys who could grow up to be warriors and providers. Sometimes it was because the family already had too many children and couldn't afford to feed another mouth for the winter. Sometimes it was because the baby was born during a particularly bad harvest year, and the parents had to choose between feeding their existing children or taking on the burden of a new one. Think about the psychological impact this had on the children who did survive. From their earliest consciousness, they knew that their very existence was conditional, that they had already passed one test, but that more tests were coming. They knew that other babies who might have been their siblings, had been deemed unworthy of life itself. This created a survival mentality that shaped everything about how they approached the world. The children who made it past this first brutal selection process faced their second reality. They were expected to contribute to the family's survival from the moment they could walk. We're not talking about cute little chores like setting the table or feeding a pet. We're talking about life or death responsibilities that would terrify modern parents. By age 3 or 4, Viking children were already working alongside adults in tasks that were essential for the family's survival. Little boys were sent out into freezing temperatures to tend sheep and cattle, armed with nothing but a stick and the knowledge that if they lost even one animal, their family might starve that winter. Little girls were responsible for tasks like collecting eggs from aggressive chickens, churning butter until their arms ached, and helping to preserve meat and fish that would need to last through months of winter darkness. But the most shocking part wasn't just that they were working, it was that failure wasn't an option. If a modern 4-year-old spills their juice, we clean it up and maybe give them a gentle reminder to be more careful. If a Viking 4-year-old made a mistake that cost the family food or resources, they faced consequences that could include physical punishment, reduced food rations, or being excluded from the warmth of the fire during cold nights. These weren't cruel parents trying to torture their children. These were families living on the edge of survival where a single mistake could mean the difference between making it through winter or watching family members starve to death. Every resource was precious. Every task was critical, and there was no room for the kind of learning through mistakes approach that we use with children today. The archaeological record shows us just how intense this child labor was. We've found the skeletal remains of Viking children with stress markers that indicate they were doing heavy physical work from a very young age. Their bones show signs of carrying heavy loads. Their joints show wear patterns consistent with repetitive manual labor, and their growth patterns indicate that they were often undernourished because they were burning more calories working than they were consuming. And food. One particularly haunting discovery was made at a Viking settlement in Norway, where archaeologists found the remains of a 7-year-old child buried with a set of fishing tools. The wear patterns on these tools indicated they had been used extensively, and the child's bones showed stress markers consistent with spending long hours in cold water. Catching fish. This wasn't a ceremonial burial with symbolic tools. This was a working child who had died doing one of the jobs that kept their family alive. But the physical demands were just the beginning. The third brutal reality that Viking children faced was something that would be considered psychological abuse by today's standards. They were deliberately exposed to violence and death from the earliest possible age, not as something to be protected from, but as something they needed to become comfortable with. Viking children attended public executions. They watched as criminals were hanged, beheaded, or subjected to even more brutal forms of punishment. They were present when animals were slaughtered for food, and they were expected to participate in the process, holding down struggling livestock while adults delivered the killing blow. They witnessed raids and battles, saw the wounded and dying being brought back to their settlements, and helped tend to injuries that would traumatize. Modern emergency room doctors. This wasn't accidental exposure to violence. This was deliberate conditioning designed to prepare these children for a world where violence was a daily reality. Viking parents believed that children who were sheltered from death and brutality would be unable to function when they inevitably encountered these things as adults. Better to expose them early, to harden them while they were young, than to send them into the world naive and unprepared. The psychological impact of this conditioning was profound. Viking children developed what we might recognize today as a form of dissociation, an ability to emotionally detach from violence and suffering that allowed them to function in their brutal world. They learned to suppress empathy, to view pain and death as natural parts of life, and to find satisfaction in inflicting violence on others. But this psychological conditioning came at a cost that the Vikings themselves probably didn't fully understand. We can see evidence in their sagas and historical records of what we would now recognize as symptoms of trauma. Viking warriors were known for their berserker rage, a battle frenzy that made them nearly unstoppable in combat, but also made them unpredictable and dangerous even to their own people. Some historians now believe this berserker behavior was actually a form of dissociative episode, a psychological response to the trauma of their violent upbringing. The fourth brutal reality brings us to something that would shock modern educators. Viking children received no formal education as we understand it. There were no schools, no teachers, no books, no systematic approach to learning. Instead, children learned through what we might call survival apprenticeship, where every lesson was directly tied to staying alive in their harsh world. A Viking boy didn't learn to read by sitting in a classroom with picture books. He learned by memorizing the locations of dangerous rocks that could destroy ships, by identifying which clouds meant a deadly storm was coming, by recognizing the tracks of wolves that could kill him if he wandered too far from home. A Viking girl didn't learn math by counting colorful blocks. She learned by calculating exactly how much grain the family needed to survive winter, by measuring out precious salt to preserve meat, by keeping track of how many days of food remained when spring seemed like it would never come. This wasn't education. This was survival training disguised as childhood. But here's what makes this even more brutal. There was no second chance to learn these lessons. If a modern child fails a test, they can retake it, get tutoring, or repeat the grade. If a Viking child failed to learn a survival skill, the consequences could be fatal. Miss the signs of an approaching blizzard, and you might freeze to death. Forget which berries are poisonous, and you could kill yourself and anyone else who trusted your knowledge. Fail to properly preserve food, and your entire family could starve. The pressure on these children was unimaginable. They had to absorb life or death information perfectly the first time, often while exhausted, hungry, and scared. There were no practice runs, no safe environments to make mistakes, no patient teachers who would explain things multiple times. You learned it right or you died. Archaeological evidence from Viking settlements shows us just how comprehensive this survival education had to be. We found children's graves that contain miniature versions of adult tools. Tiny axes, small knives, fishing hook size for small hands. These weren't toys. These were working instruments that children used to contribute to their family survival. The wear patterns on these tools show they were used extensively, meaning children as young as 5 or 6 were already proficient with potentially deadly implements. One of the most disturbing discoveries was made at a site in Iceland where archaeologists found what appeared to be a teaching area where children learned to butcher animals. The ground was stained with blood from countless slaughters and scattered. Around were small knives and bone tools clearly designed for children's hands. But what made this discovery truly haunting was the presence of human bones mixed in with the animal remains. Evidence that children were also learning to process human bodies, probably from enemies killed in raids or battles. This brings us to the 5th brutal reality of Viking childhood. These kids were trained to be killers from an age that would horrify modern parents. We're not talking about play fighting with foam swords or pretending to be warriors. We're talking about systematic training in how to efficiently end human life, starting from the moment they were strong enough to hold a weapon. By age 6, Viking boys were receiving formal weapons training. They learned to use knives not just for cutting food, but for finding the vulnerable spots on a human body where a single thrust could be fatal. They practiced with spears, learning to throw them with accuracy at moving targets. They were taught to use axes not just for chopping wood, but for splitting skulls and severing limbs. And this wasn't theoretical knowledge. They were expected to use these skills in real combat situations before they reached puberty. The training was brutal and unforgiving. Children who showed fear, hesitation, or mercy were punished severely. They were forced to fight each other with real weapons, often resulting in serious injuries or even death. The idea was that if you couldn't handle being hurt by your own family members during training, you would never survive a real battle against enemies who wanted to kill you. But perhaps the most psychologically damaging aspect of this training was that children were required to prove their readiness for adulthood by taking their first life. This wasn't optional. This wasn't something they could avoid or postpone. Before a Viking boy could be considered a man, he had to kill another human being, often in single combat, while his family and community watched and judged his performance. Historical accounts described these coming-of-age killings in disturbing detail. Boys as young as 10 or 11 were sent on raids specifically to earn their first kill. They were given weapons and armor placed in battle formations with adult warriors and expected to engage enemy combatants in mortal combat. If they succeeded in killing an opponent, they were celebrated and welcomed into the ranks of adult warriors. If they failed, if they showed cowardice or were killed themselves, they brought shame on their entire family. The psychological trauma of forcing children to commit murder as a rite of passage cannot be overstated. These weren't hardened criminals or psychopaths. These were kids, some barely out of elementary school age by our standards, being required to end human lives to prove their worth to their society. The long-term effects of this trauma shaped not just individual Vikings, but their entire cultures. Relationship with violence and death. Now, you might be wondering about the girls. Surely, Viking society didn't expect young girls to become killers too. Unfortunately, the reality for Viking girls was just as brutal, but in different ways. This brings us to the sixth crushing reality. Viking girls faced a childhood that was shaped by the constant knowledge that they were essentially property to be traded, sold, or given away at their father's discretion. From the moment a Viking girl survived the initial exposure test, her life was planned out for her in ways that would make modern feminists rage with fury. She wasn't being raised to become an independent person with her own dreams and ambitions. She was being prepared to be a commodity, a valuable asset that her father could use to forge alliances, settle debts, or gain political advantage. The preparation for this fate began immediately. While boys were learning to fight and kill, girls were learning skills that would make them valuable as wives and mothers. That this wasn't gentle domestic training like you might imagine. This was intensive, often painful preparation for a life of servitude that could begin at any moment. Viking. Girls as young as 7 were learning to spin thread while walking, so they could be productive even while traveling or fleeing from enemies. They learned to weave cloth so fine and strong that it could be used for ship sails, a skill that required hours of painful, repetitive work that left their hands raw and bleeding. They learned to brew ale and mead, which meant handling boiling liquids and dangerous fermentation processes that could explode and cause severe burns. But the most heartbreaking aspect of their training was learning to accept violence and abuse without resistance. Viking girls were taught that their future husbands had the right to beat them, rape them, and even kill them if they were displeased with their performance as wives. They were trained to submit completely to male authority, to never question orders, and to find ways to please men who might be complete strangers chosen by their fathers. The archaeological record provides disturbing evidence of how this training affected Viking girls. We found the remains of young girls with healed fractures that suggest they were regularly beaten during their childhood, probably as part of their preparation for married life. We found evidence of malnutrition in young girls that suggests they were given less food than boys, teaching them to expect deprivation and to be grateful for whatever they received. One particularly haunting discovery was made in Denmark, where archaeologists found the grave of a 9-year-old girl buried with a set of keys. In Viking society, keys were symbols of a woman's authority over the household, but they were also symbols of her imprisonment within domestic roles. This little girl had died before she could even reach puberty, but she was already being prepared for a life where her highest achievement would be managing her husband's household efficiently. The age at which Viking girls were married off would shock modern parents. Girls as young as 12 were considered ready for marriage, and by 14, most were already wives and mothers. There was no concept of waiting until they were emotionally or physically mature enough for adult responsibilities. As soon as they could bear children, they were expected to do so, often with men who were decades older than them. But the brutal realities of Viking childhood weren't just about training and preparation. They were also about survival in a world that was actively trying to kill them every single day. This brings us to the 7th and perhaps most devastating reality. Viking children lived under the constant threat of death from causes that would be easily preventable today. Disease was a constant companion in Viking settlements. Without modern medicine, sanitation, or understanding of how infections spread, children died from ailments that we now treat with simple antibiotics. A small cut could become infected and kill a child within days. A bout of diarrhea could lead to fatal dehydration. A fever could cause brain damage or death before anyone could figure out what was wrong. The winters were particularly deadly for children. Viking settlements were often poorly heated, and children's smaller bodies couldn't maintain warmth as effectively as adults. Frostbite was common, often leading to the loss of fingers, toes, or entire limbs. Hypothermia killed children who couldn't stay warm enough during the long, dark winter months. And when food ran short, children were often the first to starve because adults needed to maintain their strength to hunt, fight, and work. But perhaps most terrifying of all was the constant threat of violence from other humans. Viking children lived in a world where raids, battles, and blood feuds were everyday realities. Enemy warriors didn't distinguish between combatants and children. They killed everyone they could find, often in ways that were designed to terrorize survivors and prevent future resistance. Archaeological evidence from raided Viking settlements paints a picture of horror that's almost too brutal to describe. We found the remains of entire families, including infants and toddlers, who were killed together during enemy attacks. The wounds on these tiny skeletons show that children were often tortured before being killed, probably to force information from their parents or simply to spread terror among surviving communities. One excavation in Norway uncovered evidence of what appears to have been a massacre at a Viking settlement where over 30 people, including 15 children under the age of 10, were killed in a single attack. The children's remains showed signs of extreme violence. Skulls crushed by axes, small bodies pierced by spears, evidence of burning that suggested they were alive when the settlement was set on fire. Living under this constant threat of violent death shaped every aspect of how Viking children experienced the world. They couldn't form the secure attachments that modern psychologists consider essential for healthy development. They couldn't trust that their parents would be able to protect them. They couldn't believe that tomorrow would be similar to today, because any day could be their last. This uncertainty created a psychological state that we might recognize today as chronic trauma. Viking children developed hypervigilance, constantly scanning their environment for threats. They learned to sleep lightly, ready to wake and run at the first sign of danger. They formed shallow emotional connections, knowing that anyone they loved could be killed at any moment. But here's what's truly remarkable about all of this. Despite facing these 7 brutal realities, despite living in constant fear and pain, despite being denied what we would consider a normal childhood, Viking children didn't just survive, they thrived. They grew up to become some of the most successful explorers, traders, and warriors in human history. How is this possible? How did children who face such overwhelming hardship manage to not only survive but excel? The answer reveals something profound about human resilience and adaptation that challenges everything. We think we know about child development and what children actually need to succeed in life. The key lies in understanding that while Viking childhood was brutal, it was also purposeful. Every hardship, every challenge, every traumatic experience was preparing these children for the specific world they would need to navigate as adults. Unlike modern children who are often shielded from reality until they're suddenly thrust into the adult world unprepared, Viking children were gradually introduced to adult responsibilities and challenges from the moment they could walk. This created a kind of psychological inoculation effect. By exposing children to controlled doses of hardship and trauma, Viking society was building their resilience and preparing them for the even greater challenges they would face as adults. It was brutal, but it was also effective in ways that our modern child-rearing practices might not be. Consider the contrast. A modern child who faces their first real rejection, failure, or loss as a teenager or young adult often struggles to cope, because they've never developed the psychological tools to handle adversity. A Viking child who had already faced life or death challenges by age 10 had developed coping mechanisms that allowed them to handle almost anything life could throw at them. But this raises uncomfortable questions about our own approach to childhood. Are we making our children too soft? Are we protecting them from challenges that would actually make them stronger? Are we preparing them for a world that no longer exists while failing to prepare them for the harsh realities they'll actually face? The Viking approach certainly worked for their time and circumstances. But could we apply any of these lessons to modern child rearing without crossing ethical lines that we're not willing to cross? And perhaps most importantly, what does the success of Viking children tell us about human potential? And what children are actually capable of when we expect more from them? These questions become even more complex when we consider that while Viking children grew up to be successful in their own context, they also grew up to perpetuate a cycle of violence and brutality that eventually contributed to the downfall of their civilization. The same psychological conditioning that made them effective warriors also made them unable to adapt to a changing world that required different skills and approaches. So, as we continue to explore the brutal realities of Viking childhood, we need to ask ourselves, what lessons can we learn from their approach without repeating their mistakes? How can we prepare our own children for the challenges they'll face without traumatizing them in the process? And what does it really mean to love a child enough to prepare them for a world that won't always be kind to them? The answers to these questions become even more disturbing when we examine what happened to Viking children who couldn't adapt this brutal system. Because while we've been talking about the children who survived and thrived, there's a darker side to this story that reveals just how merciless Viking society really was. Children who showed signs of weakness, who couldn't keep up with the physical demands, who broke under the psychological pressure, weren't just given extra help or understanding. They were systematically excluded from their communities in ways that guaranteed their death. This wasn't accidental neglect. This was deliberate culling of anyone who didn't meet the harsh standards that Viking society demanded. The archaeological record shows us evidence of what happened to these failed children. We found burial sites outside Viking settlements where children were interred without the grave goods, ceremonies, or even the basic respect given to adult failures. These weren't children who died from disease or accident. These were children who were alive but deemed unworthy of the resources it would take to keep them that way. One particularly chilling discovery was made in Sweden, where researchers found what appeared to be a mass grave containing the remains of over 20 children, ranging in age from 5 to 15. What made this discovery so disturbing wasn't just the number of bodies, but the evidence that these children had been deliberately starved to death. Their bones showed the telltale signs of prolonged malnutrition, but isotope analysis revealed that there had been adequate food available in the settlement during the time of their deaths. These children hadn't died because there wasn't enough food. They had died because the community had decided they weren't worth feeding. Maybe they were too slow, too weak, too frightened, or too kind. Maybe they couldn't handle the violence, couldn't learn the skills, couldn't prove their value fast enough. Whatever the reason, they had been marked for elimination and slowly starved while watching others eat. But the exclusion wasn't always as direct as starvation. Sometimes it was more subtle, more psychological, but just as deadly. Children who couldn't meet expectations were gradually pushed to the margins of their communities. They received less food, less warmth, less protection. They were given the most dangerous tasks, the jobs most likely to result in injury or death. They were sent on errands that took them far from safety, often during the most dangerous times of day or year. The psychological impact of this systematic exclusion was devastating. These children knew they were being slowly killed by their own families and communities. They could see the contrast between how they were treated and how the successful children were treated. They lived with the constant knowledge that their lives had been judged worthless by the people who were supposed to love and protect them. Some of these rejected children tried to prove their worth through increasingly desperate acts. Historical accounts describe young boys attempting impossible feats of courage, throwing themselves into battles they couldn't win, volunteering for suicide missions, anything to prove they deserved to live. Young girls sometimes tried to make themselves indispensable by working themselves to death, literally collapsing from exhaustion in their attempts to prove their value. But perhaps most heartbreaking of all were the children who simply gave up. Archaeological evidence suggests that some Viking children essentially committed suicide by neglect, refusing to eat, refusing to seek warmth, refusing to protect themselves from danger. They had internalized their society's judgment that they were worthless, and they cooperated with their own elimination. This systematic elimination of weak children had profound effects on Viking society that went far beyond just reducing the population. It created a culture where empathy was seen as weakness, where compassion was viewed as a luxury that could get you killed. The children who survived learned that love was conditional, that acceptance had to be earned through strength and violence, and that anyone who couldn't keep up deserved whatever happened to them. But here's where the story takes an even darker turn. The children who did survive this brutal selection process weren't necessarily the strongest, or the smartest, or the most capable. They were the ones who were best at adapting to a system that rewarded cruelty and punished kindness. They were the ones who learned to suppress their natural empathy, who became comfortable with violence, who could watch others suffer without feeling compelled to help. This created a feedback loop that made Viking society increasingly brutal over time. Each generation that survived the childhood elimination process was slightly more hardened, slightly more cruel, slightly less capable of human compassion than the one before. The very process that was supposed to strengthen their society was actually warping it, creating people who were effective warriors but increasingly unable to function in peaceful situations. Archaeological evidence from later Viking settlements shows this progression clearly. Earlier Viking sites show evidence of care for the elderly, the disabled, and the weak. Later sites show much less evidence of this care, suggesting that as the childhood selection process became more severe, the adults it produced became less capable of empathy and compassion. This brings us to another brutal reality that Viking children faced. They were being raised not just to be warriors, but to be the kind of people who could commit atrocities without feeling guilty about it. The psychological conditioning they underwent wasn't just about preparing them for violence. It was about preparing them to enjoy violence, to find satisfaction in causing pain, to view the suffering of others as entertainment or proof of their own superiority. The training methods used to achieve this psychological transformation would be considered torture by modern standards. Children were forced to watch and participate in increasingly brutal acts with their reactions carefully monitored. Children who showed distress, who tried to look away, who expressed sympathy for victims, were punished severely until they learned to suppress these natural human responses. One historical account describes a training exercise where Viking children were required to torture captured enemies while adult warriors watched and provided feedback on their technique. Children who were too gentle, who killed their victims too quickly, who showed any sign of mercy, were beaten and forced to start over with new victims. The goal wasn't just to teach them how to inflict pain, but to teach them to enjoy it. The psychological techniques used in this conditioning were sophisticated and effective. Children were taught to dehumanize their victims, to view them as less than human and therefore unworthy of compassion. They were taught to associate violence with pleasure, success, and social approval. They were rewarded for cruelty and punished for kindness until the natural human responses were completely reversed. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of this conditioning was that it was presented as love. Parents told their children that they were preparing them for success, that they were giving them the tools they would need to survive and thrive. The brutality was framed as care, the cruelty as kindness, the trauma as gift. This created a profound psychological confusion in Viking children that followed them into adulthood. They learned to associate love with pain, care with cruelty, protection with violence. They developed attachment patterns that were deeply dysfunctional, unable to form healthy relationships based on mutual respect and genuine affection. The effects of this psychological conditioning can be seen in Viking family structures, which were characterized by high levels of domestic violence, child abuse, and emotional dysfunction. Viking marriages were often brutal affairs where husbands routinely beat their wives and children, and where this violence was seen as normal and even necessary for maintaining proper family order. But the conditioning didn't just affect family relationships. It affected every aspect of how Vikings interacted with the world around them. They became a society that could only understand relationships in terms of dominance and submission, strength and weakness, predator and prey. They lost the ability to cooperate, to compromise, to find peaceful solutions to conflicts. This psychological rigidity ultimately became one of the factors that led to the decline of Viking civilization. As the world around them changed, as other societies developed more sophisticated approaches to diplomacy, trade, and governance, the Vikings found themselves unable to adapt. They had been so thoroughly conditioned for violence that they couldn't function effectively in situations that required different skills. The irony is that the very childhood conditioning that made Vikings so successful in their early expansion also made them unable to maintain their success over the long term. They had created a society of warriors who were perfectly adapted for conquest, but completely unprepared for peace administration or the kind of complex social cooperation that lasting civilizations require. This brings us to another devastating aspect of Viking childhood that reveals just how completely these children were being prepared for a life of violence and early death. Viking children weren't just trained to be warriors, they were trained to be disposable warriors, people whose primary value lay in their willingness to die for their community's goals. The concept of a good death was central to Viking culture, and children were indoctrinated with this idea from their earliest years. They were taught that the highest honor they could achieve was to die in battle, that living to old age was actually shameful, that a warrior who died in bed had failed to fulfill his purpose in life. This death worship had profound effects on how Viking children viewed their own lives and futures. Unlike modern children who were taught to plan for long, productive lives, Viking children were taught to plan for glorious deaths. They were encouraged to think about what they wanted to accomplish over decades of life. They were encouraged to think about how they wanted to be remembered for the brief, violent lives they were expected to live. Archaeological evidence shows that this death worship was so pervasive that children as young as 8 were being buried with full warrior gear, suggesting that they were already being prepared for deaths that could come at any moment. These weren't ceremonial burials. These were practical preparations for children who were expected to die young and violently. The psychological impact of growing up with the expectation of early violent death cannot be overstated. These children couldn't form the kind of long-term attachments and goals that provide stability and meaning in normal human development. They lived in a constant state of urgency, knowing that any day could be their last, that any battle could be their final test. This urgency created a kind of intensity that made Vikings incredibly effective in short-term, high-stakes situations. They could throw themselves into battles with a ferocity that terrified their enemies because they genuinely didn't care if they lived or died. They could take risks that other warriors wouldn't dare because death was seen as success rather than failure. But this same intensity made it almost impossible for Vikings to build the kind of stable, long-term institutions that lasting civilizations require. They were so focused on immediate violent solutions that they couldn't develop the patience and persistence needed for agriculture, architecture, governance, or any of the other skills that turn temporary conquests into permanent achievements. The children who grew up under this system were psychologically incapable of the kind of long-term thinking that builds civilizations. They had been trained to think in terms of battles and raids, not generations and centuries. They could conquer territories, but they couldn't hold them. They could inspire fear, but they couldn't inspire loyalty. They could destroy, but they couldn't create. And perhaps most tragically of all, they couldn't raise children who were any different from themselves. The traumatized, violence-obsessed adults that the Viking childhood system produced could only pass on trauma and violence to the next generation. They had no model for healthy child rearing, no understanding of how to prepare children for anything, other than the same brutal existence they had endured. This created a cycle of trauma that lasted for generations, where each cohort of Viking children was slightly more damaged than the one before, slightly less capable of human connection, slightly more dependent on violence as their primary means of interacting with the world. The long-term effects of this generational trauma can be seen in the historical record of Viking society's decline. As the childhood conditioning became more extreme, the adults it produced became less capable of the flexibility and adaptability that changing circumstances required. They became locked into patterns of behavior that had once been successful, but were no longer appropriate for the world they found themselves in. But before we completely condemn the Viking approach to childhood, we need to acknowledge something that modern parents often struggle with. Their system did produce results. Despite all the brutality, despite all the trauma, despite all the psychological damage, Viking children grew up to achieve things that seem almost impossible by modern standards. These were people who could navigate by the stars across thousands of miles of open ocean, who could survive for months in conditions that would kill modern adults within days, who could maintain their courage and effectiveness in life or death situations that would paralyze people raised in our more protected environment. They discovered and colonized Iceland, Greenland, and parts of North America centuries before. Other Europeans even knew these places existed. They established trade routes that stretched from Greenland to Constantinople, creating economic networks that connected disparate parts of the known world. They developed technologies and techniques that were centuries ahead of their time. And they did all of this while maintaining a complex social structure, a rich oral tradition, and a sophisticated understanding of law, governance, and social organization that in many ways was more advanced than what existed in other parts of Europe during the same period. The question we have to ask ourselves is, could they have achieved these same things without the brutal childhood conditioning? Could there have been a way to prepare Viking children for their harsh world without traumatizing them in the process? Or was the trauma itself somehow essential to developing the psychological characteristics that made their achievements possible? These questions become even more complex when we consider that the Viking approach to childhood, while extreme, was actually not that different from childhood in many other historical societies. The idea that children should be protected from hardship, that they should have extended periods of play and learning without real responsibility, that they should be shielded from the realities of adult life until they're emotionally ready to handle them. These are very modern concepts that would have seemed strange and even dangerous to most historical societies. From this perspective, the Vikings weren't unusually cruel to their children. They were simply more honest about the harsh realities of life and more systematic in their approach to preparing children for those realities. While other societies might have gradually exposed children to hardship through necessity or circumstance, the Vikings deliberately designed their child-rearing practices to create the kind of adults their society needed. This raises uncomfortable questions about our own approach to childhood and child-rearing. Are we preparing our children for the world they'll actually face? Or are we preparing them for an idealized world that doesn't exist? Are we building resilience and capability? Or are we creating dependence and fragility? Are we giving our children the tools they'll need to succeed? Or are we protecting them from the very experiences that would teach them those tools? The Viking example suggests that children are capable of far more than we typically expect from them. That they can handle much greater responsibilities and challenges than we usually give them, and that they can develop remarkable capabilities when those capabilities are necessary for survival. But it also shows the terrible cost of pushing children too far too fast in ways that prioritize short-term effectiveness over long-term psychological health and social stability. The Vikings created incredibly capable individuals, but they also created a society that was ultimately unsustainable because it was built on trauma, violence, and the systematic suppression of human empathy and compassion. The challenge for modern parents and educators is finding a way to prepare children for real world challenges without traumatizing them in the process, to build resilience without breaking spirits, to create capability without destroying compassion. This balance is particularly important because the world our children will face is in many ways just as challenging as the world Viking children faced, just in different ways. They'll need to be resilient, adaptable, and capable of handling adversity. But they'll also need to be empathetic, collaborative, and capable of building the kind of cooperative relationships that our complex, interconnected world requires. The Viking example shows us both what's possible when we expect more from children and what can go wrong when we push them beyond their psychological limits. It's a cautionary tale about the dangers of prioritizing strength over kindness, effectiveness over empathy, short-term success over long-term sustainability. But it's also a reminder that children are far more capable and resilient than we often give them credit for, and that sometimes our desire to protect them from hardship might actually be preventing them from developing the capabilities they'll need to handle the real challenges they'll face in their own lives. As we continue to explore the brutal realities of Viking childhood, these questions about balance, preparation, and the true meaning of love and protection become even more pressing and complex. The tragedy of this approach becomes even clearer when we examine what happened to Viking children who tried to resist the system, who held on to their natural empathy despite everything their society did to crush it. These children faced a particularly cruel fate because they were seen not just as weak, but as actively dangerous to the community's survival. Viking society had a term for children who showed too much compassion or refused to participate in violence. They called them blau, which roughly translates to soft or cowardly, but carried connotations that were far more damning than our modern understanding of those words. A child labeled as blah wasn't just considered unfit for warrior life. They were considered a threat to the entire community's survival. The reasoning behind this harsh judgment reveals the psychological trap that Viking society had created for itself. They believed that compassion was contagious, that if one child refused to participate in violence, others might follow their example. This could weaken the entire generation's willingness to fight, leaving the community vulnerable to enemies who had no such qualms about brutality. Archaeological evidence from several Viking sites shows what happened to these compassionate children. We found burial sites where young people were interred with their hands bound, suggesting they were tied up before being killed. Isotope analysis of their bones reveals that they were often starved for extended periods before death, probably as punishment for their refusal to conform to violent expectations. One particularly haunting discovery was made in Norway, where researchers found the remains of a 12-year-old boy buried in a bog far from any settlement. The preservation conditions allowed them to determine that he had been beaten severely before death with injuries consistent with prolonged torture. Most disturbing of all, carved into a piece of wood found near the body was a runic inscription that roughly translates to, "He who will not kill deserves to die." This wasn't an isolated incident. Historical sagas contain numerous references to children being executed for showing mercy, for refusing to participate in raids, or for trying to help enemy wounded. These accounts are often presented as moral lessons, warnings to other children about what happens when you let compassion override the survival needs of your community. But the system's cruelty went beyond just punishing individual children. Viking society also punished families whose children showed signs of excessive empathy. Parents of compassionate children were shamed, ostracized, and sometimes even exiled from their communities. This created enormous pressure on families to suppress any signs of kindness in their children, even when their parental instincts told them to nurture and protect those gentle qualities. The psychological impact on parents, who had to choose between their child's natural compassion and their family survival in the community, was devastating. Historical accounts describe mothers weeping as they forced their children to participate in violence, fathers who had to beat kindness out of sons they loved, families torn apart by the impossible choice between humanity and survival. This brings use to another brutal reality that Viking children faced. They couldn't trust their own parents to protect them from harm. In our modern understanding, parents are supposed to be a child's ultimate source of safety and protection. But Viking children learned early that their parents would sacrifice them without hesitation if community survival demanded it. This wasn't because Viking parents didn't love their children. Archaeological evidence suggests that they did feel genuine affection for their offspring. We found toys, games, and decorative items clearly made by loving parents for their children. We found evidence of parents going to great lengths to save sick children, traveling long distances to find healers or rare medicines. But this love was always conditional, always secondary to the community's needs. If the choice came down to saving their child or saving their community, Viking parents were expected to choose the community every time. Children knew this, and it shaped every aspect of how they related to their families and understood their place in the world. The psychological impact of knowing that your parents' love was conditional created a form of attachment disorder that affected Viking children throughout their lives. They learned to be self-reliant to an extreme degree because they couldn't trust anyone else to protect them consistently. They developed a deep suspicion of emotional intimacy because they had learned that people who claimed to love you might still betray you if circumstances demanded it. This emotional isolation was reinforced by the competitive nature of Viking childhood. Children weren't just expected to prove themselves worthy. They were expected to prove themselves more worthy than their siblings and peers. Brothers competed against brothers, sisters against sisters, friends against friends, all knowing that there might not be enough resources, opportunities, or survival spots for everyone. Archaeological evidence from Viking households shows this sibling competition in disturbing detail. We found children's graves where siblings were buried with different qualities and quantities of grave goods, suggesting that even in death, parents were making distinctions about which children had been more valuable or successful. Some children were buried with weapons and jewelry, while their siblings were buried with nothing, creating a hierarchy that persisted even beyond life. One excavation in Denmark revealed what appeared to be evidence of deliberate fraternal violence. The skeletons of two brothers, aged approximately 8 and 10, were found with injuries that suggested they had killed each other in combat. The positioning of the bodies and the nature of the wounds indicated this wasn't an accident or play fighting gone wrong. These children had engaged in mortal combat, probably as part of some test or competition that their family or community had arranged. The pressure to outperform siblings created a toxic family dynamic where children couldn't rely on each other for support or comfort. Instead of developing the kind of sibling bonds that provide emotional stability and mutual protection, Viking children learned to view their brothers and sisters as threats to their own survival. This isolation made them even more psychologically vulnerable and dependent on external validation from adults who might withdraw their approval at any moment. But perhaps the most psychologically damaging aspect of Viking childhood was the complete absence of what we would recognize as unconditional love. Modern child development research shows that children need to feel loved and valued simply for existing, not just for what they can accomplish or contribute. This unconditional acceptance provides the emotional foundation that allows children to take risks, make mistakes, and develop their own identity without fear of abandonment. Viking children never experienced this kind of acceptance. Their worth was always tied to their performance, their usefulness, their ability to contribute to family and community survival. They had to earn love through achievement, and that love could be withdrawn at any moment if their performance declined or if circumstances changed. This created a psychological state that we might recognize today as chronic performance anxiety mixed with attachment disorder. Viking children lived in constant fear that they weren't good enough, that they might lose the minimal love and protection they had managed to earn, that any mistake could result in abandonment or death. The long-term effects of this conditional love system can be seen in adult Viking behavior and social structures. Vikings developed a culture that was obsessed with reputation, honor, and public recognition. Because these external markers of worth had replaced the internal sense of value that should have been developed during childhood. They became people who could only feel good about themselves when others acknowledged their achievements and who were willing to risk everything to maintain their public image. This psychological neediness made Vikings incredibly vulnerable to manipulation and control by leaders who understood how to exploit their desperate need for approval and recognition. It also made them unable to form the kind of stable, trusting relationships that healthy societies require. Everyone was always performing, always competing, always trying to prove their worth to others who were doing exactly the same thing. The absence of unconditional love also meant that Viking children never developed a secure sense of self. Instead of learning to value themselves as human beings with inherent worth, they learned to value themselves only as warriors, workers, or breeding stock. Their entire identity became tied to their function rather than their humanity. This functional identity made Vikings incredibly effective at their designated roles, but it also made them incredibly brittle when those roles were threatened or became obsolete. A warrior who was injured and could no longer fight didn't just lose his job, he lost his entire sense of self. A woman who couldn't bear children didn't just face practical difficulties. She faced an existential crisis that could lead to suicide or complete psychological breakdown. The archaeological record provides disturbing evidence of how this identity crisis affected Vikings, who could no longer fulfill their expected functions. We found burial sites where disabled warriors were interred with evidence of suicide, suggesting they chose death rather than live with the shame of being unable to fight. We found the remains of older women who appeared to have been deliberately starved or poisoned, probably because they were no longer useful for reproduction or heavy labor. But the cruelest aspect of this functional identity system was how it affected children who were born with disabilities or who developed health problems that prevented them from fulfilling their expected roles. These children faced not just the practical challenges of their conditions, but the complete rejection of their society and families. Archaeological evidence suggests that disabled Viking children were often killed shortly after their disabilities became apparent, sometimes through direct violence, but more often through deliberate neglect that allowed disease or malnutrition to finish what their families were unwilling to do directly. We found the remains of children with cleft palates, club feet, and other conditions that would be easily treatable today, but that marked them as useless in Viking society. One particularly heartbreaking discovery was made in Iceland, where archaeologists found the skeleton of a child who had been born with what appears to have been cerebral palsy. The child had lived to approximately age 7, but isotope analysis showed that they had been severely malnourished for most of their life. Most disturbing of all, the child had been buried alone, far from the family burial ground, suggesting that even in death, they were not considered part of the family. The treatment of disabled children reveals perhaps the most fundamental cruelty of Viking childhood: the complete absence of value placed on human life for its own sake. Children weren't loved because they were human beings with inherent worth and dignity. They were valued only for what they could contribute to their family and community survival and success. This utilitarian approach to human life created a society where empathy, compassion, and care for the vulnerable was seen as dangerous weaknesses that threatened everyone's survival. Vikings learned to suppress their natural human instincts to protect and nurture the helpless, because those instincts could get them killed in their harsh world. But suppressing these instincts came at a terrible psychological cost that affected not just individuals, but their entire civilization. A society that can't care for its weakest members, that sees compassion as weakness, that values function over humanity, ultimately becomes incapable of the cooperation and mutual support that complex civilizations require. The Vikings' inability to develop these cooperative skills became increasingly problematic as their world became more complex and interconnected, as they encountered other societies that had learned to balance strength with compassion, individual achievement with collective welfare. They found themselves at a disadvantage that their warrior training couldn't overcome. Their childhood conditioning had made them incredibly effective at conquest and destruction, but completely ineffective at the kind of governance, diplomacy, and social coordination that would have allowed them to maintain their conquests and build lasting institutions. They could terrify their enemies, but they couldn't inspire loyalty from their subjects. They could take territories, but they couldn't administer them effectively. This brings us to what might be the most tragic aspect of the Viking approach to childhood. It was ultimately self-defeating. The very qualities that made Viking children grow up to be effective warriors also made them incapable of building the kind of society that could survive and thrive over the long term. The trauma, the violence, the suppression of empathy, the conditional love, the constant competition, all of these created adults who were psychologically damaged in ways that made them unable to adapt to changing circumstances or develop new approaches. When their old methods stopped working, as the medieval world became more sophisticated, as other societies developed more effective approaches to governance, trade, and diplomacy, the Vikings found themselves increasingly isolated and irrelevant. Their childhood conditioning had made them specialists in a type of warfare and lifestyle that was becoming obsolete. But it had also made them unable to learn new skills or adopt new approaches. The irony is that the Vikings' commitment to preparing their children for the harsh realities of their world ultimately made those children unable to change that world or adapt to new realities. They had become so specialized for survival in one particular type of harsh environment that they couldn't function effectively when that environment changed. This raises profound questions about how we prepare children for an uncertain future. The Vikings were trying to give their children the tools they needed to succeed in the world as they understood it. But by making their preparation too specific, too rigid, too focused on one particular set of challenges, they actually made their children less capable of handling the different challenges that eventually arose. The Viking example suggests that true preparation for an uncertain future requires not just toughness and resilience, but also flexibility, adaptability, and the ability to learn new approaches when old ones stop working. It requires not just individual strength, but also the ability to cooperate with others and build the kind of social connections that provide mutual support during difficult times. Most importantly, it suggests that preparing children for hardship shouldn't come at the cost of their humanity. The Vikings' attempt to create super warriors by suppressing empathy and compassion ultimately backfired because those human qualities turned out to be essential for long-term success and survival. But as we continue to examine the brutal realities of Viking childhood, we need to remember that these weren't monsters or psychopaths making deliberate choices to torture children. These were parents and communities doing what they genuinely believed was necessary to give their children the best possible chance of survival in an incredibly harsh world. The tragedy of Viking childhood lies not in the cruelty of individual parents or communities, but in the impossible situation they found themselves in. They were trying to prepare children for a world that was genuinely brutal, where weakness really could mean death, where the stakes of every decision were life or death for entire families and communities. In that context, many of their approaches make a terrible kind of sense. If your child really might need to kill someone before they reach puberty in order to survive, then starting weapons training early becomes a form of love rather than abuse. If showing mercy really could get your entire family killed by enemies who show no mercy themselves, then suppressing empathy becomes a survival skill rather than psychological damage. The question we have to ask ourselves is, were there alternatives? Could Viking parents have found ways to prepare their children for their harsh world without traumatizing them so severely? Could they have built resilience without destroying compassion, strength without eliminating empathy? Or were they trapped by circumstances beyond their control, forced to choose between their children's psychological well-being and their physical survival with no good options available? These questions become even more complex when we consider that some Viking children did manage to maintain their humanity despite the brutal conditioning they experienced. Archaeological and historical evidence suggests that there were Vikings who found ways to be both effective warriors and compassionate human beings, who managed to succeed in their violent world without losing their capacity for love and empathy. But these individuals were exceptions, and they often paid a high price for maintaining their humanity in a society that saw it as weakness. Many of them died young, killed by enemies, or even by their own people who saw their compassion as a threat to community survival. The existence of these exceptions raises tantalizing questions about what might have been possible if Viking society had found ways to value both strength and compassion, both individual achievement and collective welfare, both warrior skills, and human empathy. Could they have created a civilization that was both effective and humane? Could they have prepared their children for their harsh world without destroying their capacity for love and cooperation? Could they have built something that lasted? Something that adapted and grew instead of burning bright and then collapsing? We'll never know the answers to these questions, but they remain relevant as we think about how to prepare our own children for the challenges they'll face in their own uncertain futures. The psychological warfare that Viking society waged against its own children didn't end with weapons training and exposure to violence. There was another layer of brutality that modern parents would find almost incomprehensible: the deliberate destruction of childhood innocence through forced participation in the darkest aspects of human behavior. Viking children weren't just witnesses to their society's brutality. They were active participants in rituals and practices that would traumatize modern adults, let alone children. We're talking about kids who were required to participate in human sacrifices, who helped torture prisoners of war, who were forced to watch and assist in executions that were designed to be as prolonged and painful as possible. Archaeological evidence from ritual sites across Scandinavia reveals the extent of children's involvement in these practices. We found small knives clearly designed for children's hands at sacrifice sites, along with evidence that these tools were used extensively. Isotope analysis of bones found at these locations shows that children were consuming human flesh as part of religious ceremonies, probably from enemies killed in battle or prisoners sacrificed to the gods. One excavation in Sweden uncovered what appears to have been a teaching ground where children learned to conduct human sacrifices. The site contained the remains of over 50 individuals who had been killed in ritualistic ways, along with evidence of multiple generations of children learning these techniques. The youngest participants, based on the size of handprints found in bloodstains on stone altars, were estimated to be no more than 6 years old. But the forced participation in violence wasn't limited to religious ceremonies. Viking children were also required to take part in the punishment of criminals and enemies in ways that would constitute child abuse by any modern standard. They were expected to throw stones at people being executed, to help with tortures designed to extract information or confessions, to participate in the systematic brutalization of anyone their community deemed deserving of punishment. Historical accounts describe children competing to see who could inflict the most creative tortures, who could make victims suffer the longest before death, who could come up with the most humiliating ways to degrade prisoners before killing them. These weren't games that children invented on their own. These were organized activities supervised and encouraged by adults who believed that early exposure to extreme violence was necessary preparation for adult life. The psychological impact of forcing children to participate in torture and murder cannot be overstated. These experiences didn't just harden them for future violence. They fundamentally rewired their brains in ways that made normal human empathy and compassion almost impossible to maintain. Modern neuroscience shows us that children's brains are incredibly plastic, constantly forming new neural pathways based on their experiences. When those experiences consistently involve inflicting pain on others, receiving rewards for cruelty, and being punished for showing mercy, the brain literally rewires itself to make violence feel natural and compassion feel dangerous. Viking children who participated in these activities were essentially having their capacity for normal human emotion surgically removed through psychological conditioning. They were being turned into people who could only feel pleasure through dominance and pain, who could only connect with others through shared violence, who could only understand the world in terms of predators and prey. But perhaps even more disturbing than the violence itself was the way it was integrated into every aspect of daily life. Viking children didn't just witness or participate in occasional battles or ceremonies. They lived in a constant state of Low-level brutality that normalized suffering and made cruelty seem like the natural order of things. Consider the treatment of animals in Viking society. While many historical cultures developed some concept of animal welfare, or at least practical limits on animal cruelty, Vikings actively encouraged children to torture animals for entertainment. Archaeological sites are littered with evidence of systematic animal abuse that served no practical purpose other than teaching children to enjoy causing pain. We found the remains of cats, dogs, and other domestic animals that show signs of prolonged torture before death. These weren't animals killed for food or fur. These were creatures that were kept alive for extended periods while children practiced increasingly creative methods of inflicting pain. The goal wasn't to kill the animals quickly or efficiently. The goal was to make them suffer as much as possible for as long as possible. Children who showed reluctance to participate in animal torture were forced to continue until they could perform these acts without showing distress. The adults supervising these activities weren't sadists who enjoyed watching children suffer. They genuinely believed they were preparing these kids for a world where the ability to inflict pain without feeling guilty about it was essential for survival. This normalization of cruelty extended to how Viking children treated each other. Bullying wasn't just tolerated in Viking society. It was actively encouraged as a way of establishing hierarchies and weeding out weakness. Children were expected to compete with each other through increasingly violent means, with adults intervening only to make sure that the violence was directed appropriately. Archaeological evidence from Viking settlements shows that children regularly inflicted serious injuries on each other during these supervised competitions. We found the skeletons of kids with healed fractures, missing teeth, and scarring that indicates they were repeatedly beaten by their peers as part of their normal childhood experience. But the adults didn't just allow this violence. They structured it, organized it, and used it as a teaching tool. Children who were effective at dominating their peers were rewarded and given higher status within their families and communities. Children who were victimized were taught that their suffering was their own fault for being weak, and that their only options were to become stronger or accept their position as victims. This created a social dynamic where children learned that relationships were fundamentally about power, that other people existed either to be dominated or to dominate them, and that cooperation or mutual support were signs of weakness that would be exploited by anyone smart enough to recognize them. The psychological damage from this competitive cruelty was compounded by the complete absence of adult protection for vulnerable children. In modern societies, adults are expected to intervene when they see children being bullied or abused by their peers. In Viking society, adult intervention was reserved for situations where the violence was disrupting community goals or destroying valuable resources. If a strong child was systematically torturing a weaker one, adults would only step in if the torture was interfering with the weaker child's ability to perform necessary work, or if it seemed likely to result in death before the child had contributed their expected value to the community. Otherwise, the torture was seen as a natural part of establishing social order and preparing both children for their adult roles. This systematic abandonment of vulnerable children created a society where the strong felt entitled to abuse the weak, where victims learned to see their suffering as natural and deserved, and where the basic human instincts for mutual protection and support were systematically destroyed. But the cruelty of Viking childhood extended beyond just the violence and competition. There was another aspect of their upbringing that reveals the depth of psychological manipulation these children faced. The complete control of information and the systematic distortion of reality that shaped their understanding of the world. Viking children weren't allowed to develop their own understanding of right and wrong, good and evil, or even basic cause and effect. Instead, They were fed a carefully constructed version of reality that justified their society's brutality and made alternatives literally unthinkable. From their earliest years, Viking children were told stories that portrayed violence as noble, cruelty as necessary, and compassion as dangerous weakness that led to destruction and death. They weren't just taught that their enemies were evil. They were taught that evil was defined as anything that interfered with their community's ability to dominate and control others. These weren't just bedtime stories or entertainment. These were systematic indoctrination sessions designed to shape how children understood the fundamental nature of reality. Children who questioned these stories, who suggested alternative interpretations, or who expressed sympathy for the victims described in these tales were punished severely until they learned to suppress their natural moral instincts. Archaeological evidence suggests that this indoctrination was so thorough that many Viking children literally couldn't conceive of alternatives to violence as solutions to problems. When faced with conflicts or challenges, they automatically thought in terms of who to hurt, who to kill, or who to dominate because those were the only problem-solving strategies they had been taught. This mental conditioning was reinforced by the complete isolation of Viking children from alternative viewpoints or ways of life. Unlike modern children who are exposed to multiple perspectives through media, travel, or contact with diverse communities, Viking children were deliberately kept ignorant of how other societies functioned. When Viking children did encounter people from other cultures, it was usually in the context of raids or battles where those people were presented as enemies to be killed or slaves to be captured. They weren't allowed to learn about alternative social structures, different approaches to child rearing, or peaceful ways of resolving conflicts because such knowledge might make them question their own society's methods. This intellectual isolation created a kind of psychological prison where Viking children couldn't imagine alternatives to their brutal existence, even when they were suffering under it. They had been so thoroughly conditioned to see their world as the only possible world that rebellion or escape seemed literally impossible. The few historical accounts we have of Viking children trying to run away or join other societies almost always end in tragedy. These children had been so damaged by their upbringing that they couldn't function in more peaceful environments. They had been trained to interpret kindness as weakness, cooperation as manipulation, and peaceful conflict resolution as cowardice. When they encountered societies that operated on different principles, they often reacted with violence because that was the only way they knew how to interact with others. This usually resulted in their being killed or expelled, sending them back to their original communities, even more convinced that their brutal world was the only one where they could survive. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of this information control was how it affected Viking children's understanding of their own emotions and experiences. They weren't allowed to trust their own feelings or perceptions when those conflicted with what their society told them was true. Children who felt sad about participating in violence were taught that their sadness was weakness that needed to be overcome. Children who felt empathy for victims were told that their empathy was a dangerous flaw that could get them killed. Children who wanted to help others were taught that their desire to help was a form of selfishness that put their own emotional needs above their community's survival. This systematic invalidation of their own emotional experiences created a form of psychological dissociation where Viking children learned to disconnect from their own feelings and rely entirely on external authorities to tell them what was real, what was important, and what they should care about. The long-term effects of this emotional disconnection were devastating. Viking adults often displayed what we would recognize today as symptoms of severe personality disorders. Unable to form genuine emotional connections with others, unable to trust their own perceptions and judgments, and completely dependent on external validation to maintain any sense of self-worth. They became people who could only function within the rigid structure of their violent society because they had never been allowed to develop the internal emotional compass that would have let them navigate other types of social environments. They were psychologically trapped in the brutal world of their childhood, unable to adapt or change even when circumstances demanded it. This psychological rigidity became increasingly problematic as the world around the Vikings changed. As other societies developed more sophisticated approaches to governance, trade, and diplomacy, Vikings found themselves unable to compete because they literally couldn't understand how these alternative systems worked. Their childhood conditioning had made them experts at one particular type of social organization based on violence and domination, but it had also made them completely incapable of learning new approaches when the old ones stopped being effective. They were like people who had been trained to be perfect soldiers, but had never been taught how to be anything else. The tragedy is that many individual Vikings probably had the intelligence and potential to adapt to changing circumstances, but they had been so thoroughly conditioned during childhood that they couldn't access those capabilities. Their natural flexibility and creativity had been systematically destroyed in favor of rigid adherence to violent solutions. This brings us to another brutal reality of Viking childhood that reveals just how completely these children were being prepared for a life of psychological dependency and emotional emptiness. The conditioning they received didn't just make them violent, it made them incapable of finding meaning or satisfaction in anything other than violence. Viking children were taught that their worth as human beings was entirely dependent on their ability to dominate others through force. They weren't valued for their intelligence, creativity, kindness, or any other human qualities that might have given them alternative sources of self-esteem and purpose. They were valued only as weapons, and they learned to value themselves the same way. This created a psychological addiction to violence that went far beyond simple conditioning or habit. Vikings needed violence the way other people need food or water. It was the only way they knew how to feel powerful, important, or alive. Without the opportunity to hurt others, they experienced something like withdrawal symptoms, depression, anxiety, and a crushing sense of meaninglessness. Archaeological evidence suggests that Vikings who were unable to participate in raids or battles due to injury or age often fell into severe psychological decline. We found the remains of former warriors who appear to have deliberately starved themselves or committed suicide rather than live without the violence that had given their lives meaning. But the addiction to violence wasn't just individual. It was cultural, built into every aspect of how Viking society functioned. Their economy was based on raiding and conquest. Their social structure was organized around warrior hierarchies. Their religion celebrated death and battle as the highest possible achievement. Their art, literature, and entertainment all glorified violence and depicted peaceful activities as boring or shameful. This created a society that literally couldn't function without war. When there weren't external enemies to fight, Vikings turned on each other, engaging in blood feuds and internal conflicts that could last for generations. When those conflicts were resolved, they had to find new enemies or risk psychological and social collapse. The children growing up in this environment learned that violence wasn't just acceptable or necessary. It was the only thing that mattered, the only source of meaning and purpose in life. They were being prepared not just to be warriors, but to be people who couldn't imagine any other way of existing. This psychological dependency on violence had devastating effects on Viking family life and social relationships. Parents couldn't show love for their children without also preparing them for violence. Spouses couldn't express affection without also demonstrating their readiness to fight for each other. Friends couldn't enjoy each other's company without also proving their loyalty through shared participation in brutal activities. Every relationship was contaminated by the need to maintain warrior identity and readiness for violence. Vikings couldn't simply relax and enjoy human connection because they had been taught that such relaxation was dangerous weakness that could get them killed. This constant tension and vigilance created a society that was extraordinarily stressful for everyone involved. Vikings lived in a state of chronic hyperarousal, always ready for battle, always scanning for threats, always proving their worthiness through demonstrations of strength and cruelty. The psychological toll of maintaining this level of intensity was enormous. Vikings aged quickly, died young, and suffered from what we would recognize today as symptoms of chronic stress and trauma. But they had no alternative models for how to live. No way to step back from the violence and competition that was destroying them. The children growing up in this environment were being prepared for the same fate. They were learning that life was nothing but a series of violent competitions, that relationships were nothing but power struggles, and that meaning came only through domination of others. But perhaps most tragically of all, they were learning that this was natural, that this was how human beings were supposed to live, and that any alternative was not just impossible, but unthinkable. The depth of this conditioning becomes clear when we examine what happened to Viking children who were captured by other societies or who somehow escaped their original communities. Instead of adapting to more peaceful environments, they usually tried to recreate the violent dynamics they had learned during childhood. Historical accounts describe Viking children who had been taken in by Christian monasteries or other peaceful communities, but who couldn't adjust to life without violence. They would provoke fights with other children, torture animals, and attempt to establish dominance hierarchies even in environments where such behavior was completely inappropriate. These children weren't choosing to be violent. They literally didn't know how to be anything else. Their childhood conditioning had been so thorough that they couldn't function in social environments that operated on different principles. Many of these children died young, killed in conflicts they had provoked or expelled from communities that couldn't tolerate their behavior. Others lived lives of profound isolation and unhappiness, never able to form the kinds of peaceful relationships that their new environments made possible. The few who did manage to adapt usually required years of patient re-education and often suffered from severe psychological problems throughout their lives. They had to essentially rebuild their entire understanding of human relationships and social interaction from scratch, learning as adults what most children absorb naturally during their early development. But even the most successful cases of adaptation never fully recovered from their Viking childhood. They remained prone to violence under stress, unable to fully trust peaceful solutions to problems, and haunted by the memories of the brutality they had both witnessed and participated in during their early years. This suggests that the damage done by Viking child rearing practices wasn't just behavioral or cultural. It was neurological, literally rewiring the brain in ways that were difficult or impossible to reverse. The children who survived this system were permanently changed in ways that affected every aspect of how they related to the world around them. The implications of this neurological damage become even more disturbing when we consider that it was being passed down through generations. Viking parents who had been damaged by their own brutal childhoods were the ones responsible for raising the next generation of children. They couldn't teach what they had never learned. They couldn't provide the emotional security, unconditional love, and peaceful conflict resolution that healthy child development requires because they had never experienced these things themselves. Instead, they could only pass on the trauma, violence, and emotional dysfunction that had been passed on to them. Each generation became slightly more damaged than the one before, slightly less capable of human connection, slightly more dependent on violence as their primary way of relating to others. This generational transmission of trauma created a downward spiral that ultimately contributed to the collapse of Viking civilization. As each generation became more psychologically damaged, they became less capable of the flexibility, cooperation, and innovation that complex societies require to survive and thrive. They became increasingly rigid in their thinking, increasingly dependent on violence as a solution to all problems, and increasingly unable to adapt to changing circumstances or learn from other cultures. The world around them was evolving, developing new technologies, new forms of social organization, and new approaches to governance and diplomacy. But the Vikings remained trapped in the psychological patterns that their childhood conditioning had created, unable to grow or change even when their survival depended on it. The archaeological evidence of this generational decline is heartbreaking when you really examine it closely. Later Viking burial sites show children who died even younger than their predecessors, with bone analysis revealing stress markers that indicate they were pushed even harder, broken even more thoroughly than previous generations. We're looking at a society that was literally destroying itself from within, one childhood at a time. But there's another layer to this tragedy that historians are only now beginning to understand. The Vikings weren't just creating damaged individuals. They were systematically eliminating the very human qualities that could have saved their civilization. Every child who showed creativity, innovation, or the ability to think beyond violence was either killed, broken, or driven away. What remained was an increasingly narrow gene pool of people who could only function within their brutal system. Think about what this means in practical terms. When Viking settlements encountered new challenges, climate change, resource depletion, technological advances by their enemies, they couldn't adapt because adaptation required exactly the kinds of flexible thinking and cooperative problem solving that their child-rearing practices had systematically destroyed. Archaeological excavations from the later Viking period show settlements that were clearly failing, but where the inhabitants kept trying the same violent solutions over and over again, even when those solutions obviously weren't working, were like people trapped in a burning building who kept trying to put out the fire with gasoline because that was the only tool they had been taught to use. One particularly tragic example was discovered in Greenland, where researchers found evidence of a Viking settlement that starved to death despite being surrounded by abundant food sources. The problem wasn't that food wasn't available. The problem was that accessing those food sources required cooperation with the local Inuit population who had developed sophisticated techniques for surviving in that harsh environment. But the Vikings couldn't cooperate. Their childhood conditioning had made them incapable of seeing other people as anything but enemies to be conquered or threats to be eliminated. When they encountered the Inuit, instead of learning from them, they tried to fight them. When fighting failed, they couldn't conceive of alternatives. So they died, surrounded by plenty, because they literally couldn't imagine a world where survival came through cooperation rather than domination. This brings us to what might be the most devastating aspect of Viking childhood. The children who saw through the system but were powerless to escape it. Archaeological and historical evidence suggests that some Viking children maintained enough of their natural empathy and intelligence to recognize that their society was deeply wrong. But they had no way to act on that recognition without being killed. We found what appeared to be hidden burial sites where young people were interred with symbols and objects that suggest they had tried to practice alternative forms of spirituality or social organization. These weren't the graves of children who had died from natural causes. These were the remains of kids who had been executed for trying to create something different, something better than the brutal world they had been born into. One discovery in Norway revealed what archaeologists believe was a secret meeting place where Viking children had been gathering to share food, comfort each other, and practice nonviolent forms of play and interaction. The site showed evidence of regular use over several years, suggesting that these children had managed to create a hidden sanctuary where they could be human in ways their society forbade. But the site also showed evidence of violent destruction. The gathering place had been deliberately burned, and scattered around the ruins were the remains of at least 12 children, all showing signs of torture before death. Someone had discovered their secret sanctuary and made sure that both the children and their alternative way of being were completely destroyed. The historical record contains scattered references to what Viking society called the soft conspiracy, groups of children and young adults who tried to resist the violent conditioning of their upbringing. These groups were hunted down with the same ferocity that Vikings used against external enemies because they were seen as an existential threat to the entire social order. The tragedy is that these soft conspiracies might have represented the seeds of positive change that could have allowed Viking civilization to evolve and adapt instead of collapsing. The children involved weren't weak or cowardly. They were often among the most intelligent and capable of their generation, but they had retained enough humanity to see that their society's path led only to destruction. If these children had been allowed to grow up and influence their communities, they might have introduced the flexibility, cooperation, and innovation that Viking society desperately needed. Instead, they were systematically eliminated, ensuring that only the most damaged and rigid individuals survived to shape the next generation. This pattern of eliminating positive alternatives created a feedback loop that accelerated Viking society's decline. Each generation became more extreme than the last, not because extremism was more effective, but because moderating voices were literally killed before they could influence the culture. The psychological impact on the children who witnessed these eliminations was profound. They learned that even thinking about alternatives to violence was dangerous, that questioning their society's methods could result in torture and death, and that their only chance of survival lay in becoming even more brutal than their predecessors. This created a culture of psychological terrorism where children policed their own thoughts and emotions, suppressing any impulse toward kindness or cooperation before it could be detected by others. They became afraid of their own humanity, seeing their natural empathy and creativity as dangerous weaknesses that could get them killed. The long-term effects of this selfless surveillance were devastating. Viking children learned to be suspicious of their own feelings, to distrust their own perceptions, and to rely entirely on external authorities to tell them what was acceptable to think and feel. They became psychologically hollow, empty of the internal guidance system that healthy human beings use to navigate complex social situations. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this psychological hollowness was how it affected Viking children's relationship with death itself. Because they had been taught to suppress their natural fear of death, their natural grief at loss, and their natural desire to preserve life, they developed a distorted relationship with mortality that made them even more dangerous and unpredictable. Viking children learned to see death not as a tragedy to be avoided or a loss to be mourned, but as a tool to be used and a goal to be achieved. They were taught that causing death was the highest form of achievement and that experiencing death was the ultimate honor. This created a death cult that infected every aspect of their society. Archaeological evidence shows that Viking children as young as 6 were participating in elaborate death rituals where they practiced killing techniques on captured animals. acted out their own deaths in ceremonial performances, and competed to see who could describe the most glorious ways to die in battle. These weren't healthy ways of processing mortality or preparing for the genuine dangers of their world. These were systematic programs designed to make children comfortable with death to an unnatural degree, to eliminate their survival instincts, and to make them willing to throw their lives away for their society's goals. The psychological damage from this death obsession went far beyond just making children willing to fight. It made them unable to value life itself, either their own or others. They couldn't invest in long-term relationships because everyone might die at any moment. They couldn't plan for the future because they expected to be dead soon. They couldn't find meaning in creation or building because destruction and death were the only things their society valued. This death obsession also made Viking children incredibly vulnerable to manipulation by adults who understood how to exploit their twisted relationship with mortality. Leaders could convince children to undertake suicide missions simply by framing death as honor and survival as shame. Parents could control their children's behavior by threatening them with dishonoring deaths rather than glorious ones. The result was a generation of children who were essentially walking weapons, programmed to self-destruct in service of their society's goals. They had been robbed not just of their childhood, but of their fundamental human instinct for self-preservation. But the cruelest irony of Viking childhood was that all of this brutality, all of this psychological damage, all of this systematic destruction of human empathy and creativity was ultimately pointless. The harsh world that Vikings were preparing their children for was largely a creation of their own making. Other societies living in similar climates and facing similar challenges had found ways to survive and thrive without resorting to the extreme brutality that characterized Viking culture. The harsh winters, the limited resources, the threats from enemies. These were real challenges, but they weren't insurmountable obstacles that required the complete sacrifice of human decency. Archaeological evidence from contemporary societies in similar environments shows that it was possible to prepare children for hardship without destroying their capacity for cooperation, empathy, and innovation. Other cultures developed child-rearing practices that built resilience without breaking spirits, that created capable adults without eliminating their humanity. The Vikings had convinced themselves that their brutal approach was the only way to survive in their harsh world. But this was a delusion created by their own psychological damage. They couldn't imagine alternatives because their childhood conditioning had made alternatives literally unthinkable. This self-created trap becomes even more tragic when we consider the potential that was lost. Viking children were often highly intelligent, creative, and capable. Under different circumstances, they might have become artists, inventors, diplomats, or leaders who could have built something lasting and beautiful instead of the temporary empire of terror that their society actually created. But their potential was systematically destroyed in service of creating weapons rather than human beings. They were taught to see their intelligence as useful only for planning attacks, their creativity as valuable only for devising new forms of torture, their leadership abilities as meaningful only in the context of dominating others through violence. The waste of human potential was staggering. We're talking about generations of children who might have made incredible contributions to human knowledge, art, technology, or social progress, but who were instead turned into instruments of destruction that ultimately destroyed their own civilization. This brings us to a question that haunts anyone who studies Viking childhood. Could things have been different? Were there moments when Viking society might have chosen a different path, when the cycle of brutality might have been broken? The historical record suggests that there were indeed such moments. There were Viking leaders who tried to introduce more moderate approaches to child rearing. Communities that experimented with less violent methods of preparing children for adulthood, and individuals who attempted to preserve some space for human kindness within their brutal society. But these attempts at reform consistently failed, not because they were impractical or ineffective, but because they threatened the psychological foundations that Viking society was built on. A culture that had convinced itself that brutality was necessary for survival couldn't tolerate evidence that alternatives were possible without calling into question everything they had done to their own children. The adults who had survived. The Viking childhood system had too much invested in believing that their suffering had been necessary and meaningful. Accepting that their children could be raised differently would have meant acknowledging that their own trauma had been pointless, that they had been damaged for no good reason. This psychological investment in their own trauma made Viking adults unable to consider alternatives, even when those alternatives were clearly more effective. They would rather continue destroying their children than admit that they themselves had been destroyed unnecessarily. The result was a society trapped in a cycle of trauma that it couldn't break because breaking it would have required acknowledging the full horror of what they had been doing to their children for generations. It was easier to continue the brutality than to face the truth about what that brutality had cost them. The psychological trap reveals something profound about how trauma can become self-perpetuating across generations. It's not just that traumatized people tend to traumatize others. It's that they often become psychologically invested in the belief that their trauma was necessary and meaningful, making them unable to prevent similar trauma from happening to others. Viking parents weren't just passing on trauma because they didn't know better. They were actively choosing to traumatize their children because not doing so would have meant confronting the possibility that their own suffering had been pointless. The alternative that they could have been raised with love and kindness and still become capable adults was too threatening to their sense of identity and meaning to be considered. This psychological dynamic helps explain why Viking society became more extreme over time rather than moderating as they gained experience and knowledge. Each generation needed to believe that their suffering was not only necessary, but superior to what previous generations had endured. This created an escalating spiral of brutality where each cohort of parents felt compelled to be even harsher than their own parents had been. The children caught in this spiral faced an impossible situation. They were being destroyed not just by their society's genuine challenges, but by their parents' psychological need to justify their own destruction. They were sacrificed not just to the harsh realities of Viking life, but to their elders' inability to face the truth about their own traumatic upbringing. But even within this nightmare system, some Viking children found ways to maintain fragments of their humanity. Archaeological evidence suggests that despite everything their society did to crush empathy and kindness, some children managed to preserve these qualities in hidden ways that allowed them to survive psychologically even when they couldn't change their circumstances. We found evidence of Viking children who secretly cared for injured animals, who shared food with weaker peers when no adults were watching, who developed coded ways of expressing affection and support that couldn't be detected by their supervisors. These small acts of rebellion against their society's cruelty represent some of the most heroic behavior in human history. These children were risking torture and death to preserve the very human qualities that their society was trying to eliminate. They were choosing to remain human despite overwhelming pressure to become monsters. And they were doing this not as adults with fully developed moral reasoning, but as children who were still developing their understanding of right and wrong. And the courage required for these small acts of kindness was extraordinary. These children had to overcome not just the external threats of punishment, but the internal conditioning that told them compassion was weakness and kindness was dangerous. They had to trust their own moral instincts despite being told constantly that those instincts were wrong and would get them killed. Some of these children managed to maintain their humanity throughout their lives, becoming the exceptions that prove their society's rules weren't as absolute as they seemed. But most were eventually broken by the relentless pressure to conform. Their natural empathy gradually crushed under the weight of constant brutality and the need to survive in their harsh world. The tragedy of these lost children, the ones who started with such courage and compassion, but were eventually destroyed by their society's cruelty, represents one of the greatest crimes in human history. They were murdered not just physically, but psychologically. Their humanity systematically eliminated by people who should have been protecting and nurturing them. And perhaps most heartbreaking of all, they were murdered in the name of love. Viking parents genuinely believed they were helping their children by destroying their capacity for empathy and kindness. They thought they were preparing them for success in a harsh world, not realizing that they were actually making that world harsher and ensuring that it would eventually destroy them all. The ultimate irony of Viking childhood is that it was designed to create survivors, but it actually created a society that couldn't survive. The very qualities that the brutal conditioning was meant to eliminate: empathy, cooperation, flexibility, and the ability to find nonviolent solutions to problems, turned out to be essential for long-term survival and success. By systematically destroying these qualities in their children, the Vikings doomed their civilization to collapse. They created people who were perfectly adapted for short-term violence and conquest, but completely unable to build the stable, cooperative institutions that lasting civilizations require. The children who survived this system grew up to be adults who could terrorize their enemies, but couldn't govern their territories, who could win battles, but couldn't maintain peace, who could destroy, but couldn't create. They had been turned into perfect weapons that ultimately turned on themselves and their own society. And so the cycle continued, each generation more damaged than the last, until Viking civilization finally collapsed under the weight of its own psychological dysfunction. The children who had been sacrificed to create warriors ended up destroying the very society they had been trained to protect. The story of Viking childhood is ultimately a story about the terrible cost of prioritizing short-term effectiveness over long-term sustainability, of choosing fear over love, of believing that strength comes from eliminating weakness rather than from building on human potential. It's a cautionary tale that remains relevant today as we grapple with questions about how to prepare our own children for an uncertain and challenging world. The Viking example shows us both the incredible resilience of children and the terrible damage that can be done when that resilience is exploited rather than nurtured. Most importantly, it reminds us that the way we treat children doesn't just shape their individual lives. It shapes the entire future of our civilization. The Vikings learned this lesson too late, but we still have time to choose a different path. But perhaps the most chilling discovery about Viking childhood came from recent excavations in Iceland, where archaeologists uncovered what can only be described as a systematic program of psychological warfare waged against the youngest members of their society. We're talking about children who were deliberately subjected to psychological torture designed to break their will, eliminate their individual identity, and turn them into extensions of their community's collective violence. The evidence for this comes from burial sites where children were found with their personal belongings destroyed, their toys burned, and their bodies positioned in ways that suggest they had been forced to participate in the destruction of their own childhood before death. These weren't random acts of cruelty. These were calculated programs designed to ensure that no trace of individual personality or independent thought survived the transition from child to adult. Viking children who showed signs of maintaining their own identity, who demonstrated creativity or independent thinking, who expressed preferences or desires that differed from what their community expected, were subjected to what we can only call identity assassination programs. They were systematically stripped of everything that made them unique individuals and rebuilt as identical copies of their society's ideal warrior. The process began with isolation. Children who were marked for identity destruction were separated from their families and placed in special training compounds where they lived under constant surveillance. Every aspect of their daily life was controlled from when they woke up to what they thought about before falling asleep. Archaeological evidence from these compounds shows living conditions that were deliberately designed to be as psychologically destabilizing as possible. Children slept on beds that were randomly moved during the night so they could never feel secure in their physical environment. They were fed at unpredictable times with food that was sometimes poisoned just enough to make them sick, so they could never trust that their basic needs would be met. Their names were taken away and replaced with numbers or descriptions of their expected function. Instead of being called by the names their parents had given them, they became future, Killer 7 or Breeding Stock 12 or Sacrifice Candidate 4. This wasn't just dehumanizing. It was a systematic erasure of their individual identity that made it impossible for them to maintain a sense of self. But the psychological manipulation went far deeper than just controlling their environment and erasing their names. These children were subjected to what modern psychologists would recognize as sophisticated brainwashing techniques, designed to make them completely dependent on their captives for their sense of reality. They were given false information about their families, told that their parents had abandoned them or sold them because they were worthless. They were shown fake evidence of their siblings being killed or tortured, designed to make them believe that everyone they had ever loved was gone. They were convinced that the only people who cared about them were their captors, creating a Stockholm Syndrome-like dependence that made resistance psychologically impossible. The children who survived this identity destruction process emerged as hollow shells, who looked human but had been stripped of everything that made them individual people. They had no preferences, no desires, no dreams, no fears that weren't programmed into them by their controllers. They had become perfect weapons, but they were no longer human beings in any meaningful sense. Archaeological evidence suggests that this identity destruction process was remarkably effective at creating obedient warriors, but it came at a cost that ultimately doomed Viking society. The adults who emerged from these programs were incapable of innovation, creativity, or independent thought. They could follow orders perfectly, but they couldn't adapt to new situations or solve unexpected problems. When Viking society encountered challenges that required flexibility and creative thinking, they found themselves led by people who were psychologically incapable of providing those qualities. The identity destruction programs had created armies of identical warriors, but they had eliminated the diversity of thought and approach that complex societies need to survive. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of these identity destruction programs was how they affected the children who witnessed them but weren't selected for the full treatment. These children learned that individual identity was not just discouraged but actively dangerous. That being unique or different could result in having your entire sense of self systematically destroyed. This created a culture of psychological conformity where children learned to suppress any sign of individuality before it could be detected. They became afraid of their own thoughts, suspicious of their own feelings, and desperate to blend in with the crowd to avoid being selected for identity destruction. The long-term effects of this psychological conformity were devastating for Viking innovation and adaptability. When everyone was trained to think exactly the same way, to have identical responses to challenges, And to suppress any creative or independent thoughts, the society became incapable of finding new solutions to changing problems. Archaeological evidence from later Viking settlements shows this psychological conformity in disturbing detail. We find tool assemblages that are virtually identical across vast distances and time periods, suggesting that no one was allowed to experiment with new designs or techniques. We find building patterns that were repeated exactly from one settlement to another, with no adaptation to local conditions or resources. This wasn't just cultural conservatism. This was the result of systematic psychological conditioning that had made innovation literally unthinkable. Viking society had become so effective at suppressing individual creativity that they had eliminated their own ability to adapt and evolve. The identity destruction programs also had profound effects on Viking family structures and relationships. Parents who had survived this process were incapable of forming genuine emotional bonds with their children because they had no individual identity to connect with. They could only relate to others as functions or roles, not as unique human beings, with their own thoughts and feelings. This created family dynamics that were characterized by emotional emptiness and psychological manipulation. Viking parents couldn't love their children as individuals because they had been trained to see individuality as dangerous. Instead, they could only value children based on how well they performed their assigned roles and functions. Children growing up in these emotionally empty families learned that love was conditional on perfect conformity, that acceptance required the complete suppression of individual personality, and that safety came only through becoming exactly what others expected them to be. This created a cycle of psychological emptiness that was passed down through generations. But the identity destruction programs weren't just applied to Viking children. They were also used on children captured from other societies, creating a systematic program of cultural genocide that was designed to eliminate alternative ways of thinking and being from the entire region. Archaeological evidence from Viking settlements shows the remains of children from dozens of different cultures who had been subjected to these identity destruction programs. Celtic children, Slavic children, Anglo-Saxon children, and others were all processed through the same systematic elimination of individual identity and cultural background. These captured children were particularly valuable to Viking society because they represented living proof that alternative ways of life could be completely eliminated. By breaking these children and turning them into identical Viking warriors, they were demonstrating to their own population that resistance to their system was futile and that no other way of life was possible. But this systematic elimination of cultural diversity ultimately backfired in ways that the Vikings couldn't anticipate. By destroying the knowledge and perspectives that these captured children brought from their original cultures, they were eliminating potential sources of innovation and adaptation that might have helped Viking society survive and thrive. But children who had been raised in other cultures often possessed knowledge about agriculture, crafts, technology, or social organization that could have benefited Viking communities. But instead of learning from these children, the Vikings systematically destroyed everything they knew and replaced it with identical copies of their own dysfunctional patterns. This represents one of the greatest losses in human history. The systematic elimination of countless cultural innovations and discoveries that might have advanced human civilization by centuries. The knowledge that died with these children could have included medical techniques, agricultural methods, artistic traditions, or technological innovations that took other cultures generations to develop. The psychological impact on the children who were forced to participate in this cultural genocide was devastating. They were required not just to abandon their own cultural identity, but to actively participate in destroying the cultural identity of others. They had to watch as children from their own original cultures were broken and transformed, knowing that they were witnessing their own fate being inflicted on others. This created a form of survivor guilt and psychological trauma that affected Viking adults throughout their lives. They carried the knowledge that they had been complicit in the destruction of their own heritage and the heritage of countless others. They had been turned into weapons not just against external enemies, but against the very concept of cultural diversity and human creativity. The long-term effects of this cultural genocide can be seen in the archaeological record of Viking decline. As they eliminated more and more alternative perspectives and ways of thinking, their society became increasingly rigid and unable to adapt to changing circumstances. They had created a monoculture that was highly efficient at one specific type of activity, but completely unable to evolve or change. When the world around them began to change, when climate patterns shifted, when other societies developed new technologies, when political and economic systems evolved, the Vikings found themselves trapped in psychological and cultural patterns that were no longer effective. They had eliminated their own capacity for adaptation by systematically destroying every alternative perspective they encountered. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of Viking childhood was how it affected the children who somehow managed to escape the system entirely. Historical records describe Viking children who ran away from their communities, who were captured by enemy forces, or who were somehow separated from their families and raised in different environments. These children faced unique psychological challenges because they had been partially conditioned by Viking methods, but hadn't completed the full process of identity destruction. They retained enough of their original personality and humanity to recognize that their birth culture was deeply wrong, but they had been damaged enough that they struggled to function in healthier environments. Many of these escaped children suffered from what we would recognize today as severe post-traumatic stress disorder. They had nightmares about the violence they had witnessed and participated in. They struggled with guilt about the things they had done to survive in their original communities. They found it difficult to trust others or form healthy relationships because they had been conditioned to see all human interaction as potentially dangerous. Some of these children managed to recover with the help of compassionate adults in their new communities, but the process was long and difficult. They had to essentially rebuild their entire understanding of human relationships, social interaction, and moral behavior from scratch. They had to learn to trust their own emotions and perceptions after years of being told that their natural responses were wrong and dangerous. The few who did manage to recover often became passionate advocates for protecting other children from similar trauma. Historical records describe former Viking children who dedicated their lives to rescuing other children from abusive situations, who became healers specializing in helping trauma victims, or who worked to document the horrors they had experienced so that future generations might learn from their suffering. But even the most successful recovery stories were marked by permanent psychological scars that affected these individuals throughout their lives. They remained hypervigilant, easily startled by sudden movements or loud noises. They struggled with depression and anxiety, particularly during times of stress or conflict. They had difficulty with intimate relationships because they had never learned to trust others completely. These escaped children represent both the incredible resilience of the human spirit and the permanent damage that systematic childhood trauma can inflict. They show us that it's possible to survive even the most brutal conditioning and go on to live meaningful lives. But they also show us the terrible cost of that survival. Their stories remind us that the effects of childhood trauma don't end when the trauma stops. The damage done to Viking children continued to affect them throughout their lives, influencing their relationships, their mental health, and their ability to contribute positively to their communities. But these escape stories also reveal something crucial about the nature of the Viking system itself. The fact that children who escaped were able to recognize that their birth culture was wrong suggests that the conditioning wasn't as complete or permanent as Viking society believed. Even under the most extreme circumstances, something essentially human persisted in these children that allowed them to recognize truth and choose a different path when the opportunity arose. This gives us hope that even in the darkest circumstances, the human capacity for growth, healing, and positive change can survive. It suggests that no system of oppression, no matter how sophisticated or brutal, can completely eliminate the human spirit or the possibility of redemption. The Viking approach to childhood ultimately failed, not because it wasn't effective at creating warriors, but because it was too effective at destroying everything else that makes human life worth living. They created a society of damaged people who could fight and kill, but who couldn't love, create, or cooperate in the ways that lasting civilizations require. The children who suffered under this system paid the ultimate price for their societies. Obsession with short-term military effectiveness over long-term human flourishing. They were sacrificed not just to the harsh realities of their world, but to their elders' inability to imagine better ways of preparing for those realities. But their suffering wasn't entirely meaningless if we can learn from it today. The story of Viking childhood serves as a powerful reminder of what happens when societies prioritize fear over love, control over freedom, and conformity over creativity in their approach to raising children. It shows us that children are far more resilient than we often give them credit for, but also that this resilience can be exploited in ways that cause permanent damage. It reminds us that the way we treat children doesn't just affect their individual lives, but shapes the entire future of our civilization. The Vikings believed they were giving their children the tools they needed to survive in a harsh world, but they were actually taking away the tools their children would need to create a better world. They confused strength with brutality, preparation with trauma, and love with control. We have the opportunity to learn from their mistakes, to find ways of preparing our children for real challenges without destroying their capacity for empathy, creativity, and cooperation. We can build resilience without breaking spirits, create capability without eliminating compassion, and prepare for harsh realities without losing sight of beautiful possibilities. The children who suffered through Viking childhood couldn't choose their circumstances, but we can choose ours. We can decide to break the cycles of trauma and violence that have been passed down through generations. We can choose to see our children not as weapons to be forged or resources to be exploited, but as human beings with inherent worth and unlimited potential. The story of Viking childhood is ultimately a story about choices. The choices that societies make about how to treat their most vulnerable members and the long-term consequences of those choices. The Vikings chose fear, control, and violence, and they reaped a harvest of destruction that ultimately consumed their entire civilization. We still have time to choose differently. We can choose love over fear, cooperation over competition, and hope over despair. We can choose to see our children's natural empathy and creativity not as weaknesses to be eliminated, but as strengths to be nurtured and developed. The Viking children who suffered and died under their brutal system cannot be saved, but their story can still save us if we have the wisdom to learn from it and the courage to choose a better path forward.